July 15, 1997, Miami Beach, Florida. In the early morning sunshine, a man waits outside the palatial home of the designer, Gianni Versace.
Gianni Versace lived a very carefree life. Everybody loved him, everybody liked him in the community. Why would anybody want to hurt him?
But Andrew Cunanan is not a fan hoping to catch a glimpse of or a word with one of international fashion's most iconic figures. Andrew Cunanan is a stalker, and he has more than fan worship on his mind.
He was a typical sociopath, someone without a conscience, someone who was extremely vengeful, and he wanted to get even.
Within moments, Versace is dead, assassinated with bullets fired from Cunanan's PT-100 semi-automatic pistol.
He was shot at point-blank range. There was no way he could possibly have survived an onslaught like that.
Andrew Cunanan has used the gun before. In the last 4 months, he's murdered 4 other people, 3 of them with the pistol that just killed the #1 celebrity of the fashion world.
And he was brutally traveling around the country and shooting people.
I think that everything that inside him that was unrealized, that he felt he deserved more, that he wanted to have more, I think that came out in a rage and a sickness that was eventually directed at Gianni Versace.
This is the story of the murder of Gianni Versace, how Andrew Cunanan crossed the United States with murder on his mind, killing anything that got in his way, and how he finally stalked his prey in a targeted and clinical operation that was always destined to end in tragedy. When police were called to 1116 Ocean Drive in Miami Beach, Florida on a warm July morning, they were unsure what to expect. They'd received reports of a shooting at Casa Casuarina, the opulent home of the fashion designer Gianni Versace.
So helicopters, somebody shot Johnny. I just felt it.
I got a call from our bureau chief, and she said, Versace's been killed in front of his mansion on the beach.
What they found would reverberate around the world and throw the world of fashion into mourning.
He was shot in the back of the head with a semi-automatic weapon.
There was blood on the stairs, a lot of blood. There was 2 .40 caliber casings in close proximity to Mr. Versace's body. It was a media circus. There was thousands of people there, media from all over the world. It was amazing how quickly the word got out.
It was just pandemonium. There was also already a huge crowd of people. There was crime tape out there. It happened so fast that witnesses were still around.
A lady observed a man come up behind Mr. Versace, yell something at him. Mr. Versace turned around and the man shot Mr. Versace twice in the head, and then he fled north on Ocean Drive wearing a baseball cap and a backpack.
The suspect ran into a nearby parking garage.
The uniform officers that were there set a perimeter around the garage. More and more uniform officers showed up, and we did a search of the garage. The subject was not located. He was gone. There was a witness that said while the police were setting their perimeter that a subject fitting his description had gone up to the roof of the garage and looked over, and then gone down the escalator emergency exit and gotten into a yellow taxi.
People were asking, why Versace? Why him? It was a mystery.
Didn't have a motive. Didn't know if this was a random shooting, a professional hit, an argument. Had no clue at that juncture what was going on.
But the assassination of Gianni Versace wasn't some random act of violence. It was the culmination of a nationwide killing spree by a man who would let nothing stand in his way to get what he wanted. A man who had lived most of his life pretending. Andrew Cunanan's journey to Florida was the final act in a life of deception and deceit, which he played out across the previous decade.
Andrew Cunanan was certainly a sociopath, but probably a psychopath, completely remorseless, lived on life's edges, was infatuated with himself, and was going to do anything he could to make his life better.
Andrew Cunanan was the youngest of 4 children. He had a genius IQ. He had a big laugh. He wanted to be famous, and he wanted to be the life of the party.
He was kind of pampered and spoiled by his parents. He went to the better school. He got things that his other siblings didn't get, you know, just because he was the youngest kid. They really spoiled him.
So Andrew came from a relatively modest family. His family were Filipinos of Philippine stock. He really, from the time he was a teenager, he had this aspiration to do much better than his family did. And that was something that troubled him enormously. He really was ashamed of his family. He was constantly trying to cover up for, he would lie and really spin these extraordinary tales about his background already when he was a teenager, and so that people didn't really know what was truth and what was fiction when it came to Andrew Cunanan.
He went to college, but he was only in college for like 1 year, and then he quit, and that's when he got into the party scene, and his family had no idea he was gay at the time.
By 1989, Andrew had moved to San Francisco and had become a fixture on the gay scene in and around the Castro district of the city, later moving to San Diego.
Andrew was a talented Mr. Ripley. He could be anything to anybody. He was whatever the person seemed to want him to be. He was very knowledgeable. He knew everything from the newest opera to some hotel in Marrakesh. He was a chameleon. He blended in anywhere. He took people's stories and he absorbed them, and then he would turn them back as if he had been the person that they happened to.
He began to use aliases. Many of the people he met knew him variously as Andrew De Silva, Lieutenant Commander Andy Cummings, Drew Cunningham, and Kurt Matthew Damaris.
He was really out to latch on to money and anybody who had money and liked to live as large as he possibly could. He would treat his friends to elaborate dinners and expensive wine and trips, and nobody was quite sure how he paid for it all.
So where did he get the money?
Andrew Cunanan was a gigolo. He preyed on older men. He would research them. He would find out where they liked to go. He would like to find out their interests, and then he would insert himself into their surroundings so that they would meet him.
There was a bit of a mystery to the end, actually, if he was a prostitute or if he just was a kept man and was able to really exploit that for years. He never really kind of got off the ground in terms of any career or job prospects.
And there was a darker side to Andrew.
He had a drug habit. He did drugs. He drank a lot. He partied, and pretty much that was his whole life.
But in the spring of '97, the lavish life to which Andrew Cunanan had become accustomed came to a sudden halt.
Andrew recently found himself out in the street. His sponsor, Norman Blanchford, had refused to buy him a new Mercedes and sort of kicked him out. So he went from living in this $1 million house on the ocean, on the Pacific Ocean, to being out on the street. He had to make his own money suddenly. He was selling crystal meth and steroids, and he just didn't have the lifestyle that he was used to anymore.
He kind of went into a bit of a depression. You know, he gained weight. His hair was unkempt, which was very, very unlike him. He was always very well kept, always looked good, well dressed. So his friends noticed this, like for a 3-month period where he was not himself.
The drugs had taken a toll. He was no longer the boy toy that had made him so much money in the past.
He had fallen on hard times, didn't have the wherewithal to live the life he wanted to live, didn't have the people to support him as he once had, and he was, again, this is all armchair analysis, wound up to be a remorseless killer who, if he didn't get what he wanted, would kill.
It was time, it appeared, to get out of California.
There was nothing left in San Diego for Cunanan. People were onto him. They knew he was just a trickster, a liar, that he had no money anymore. So he decided that he was going to go to Minnesota and visit his old flame, David Madsen.
It was the beginning of a journey that would end in infamy, tragedy, and the death of international fashion icon Gianni Versace. But what led Cunanan to Versace? It's been said that they'd met in the past, but even now, confusion still exists over whether they ever had.
One of the rumors is that he and this Andrew Cunanan, who shot him, had encountered each other somewhere.
It wouldn't surprise me to know that Versace and Cunanan had met in San Francisco sometime before he went to Minnesota.
I don't think that they ever met. I don't think it was certainly any sort of intentional meeting where you would have created any connection that was meaningful in the story that came after. The talk was that the two of them had been lovers and that Cunanan was a spurned lover and therefore he took revenge somehow. There's certainly no evidence of that. Gianni Versace's longtime partner always denied that there was any connection or any contact at all with Cunanan.
If the two had met, then it was most likely fleetingly, and it's just as likely that it held no significance for the designer. Gianni Versace was at the height of his powers.
He created one of the icons in fashion, a style that has affected all of us in the most colorful way that we dress, the way we think about fashion. I mean, he was one of the founding fathers of modern fashion, certainly modern Italian fashion. I mean, they used to say that Armani dressed the wife and Versace dressed the mistress. And that still is basically how you can envision Italian fashion. He came from the southernmost part of Italy, from the Boot, basically Calabria, right across from Sicily. He was born into a pretty modest family, but a solid middle-class family. His mother was a seamstress, and that's where he took his inspiration from. He had two siblings. He had his older brother, and he had his younger sister, who was, flamboyant from the day she was born. She dyed her hair, white blonde when she was already a teenager. When she was 13, she was dressed to the nines in clothes that he made her, and the two of them would go out. She always accepted who he was, accepted that he was gay, and just found life enormously fun, and he really tapped into that then when he was younger, and certainly later with his designs.
Gianni Versace went to Milan when he was 26, and he trained in some smaller fashion houses, and he opened his own place in 1978 off of the main drag. But it became popular enough so that within a decade, he was dressing Princess Diana and rock stars, and he became a rock star himself. He turned fashion from a niche industry into a rock star industry.
His contribution was the melding, the marrying of the street, sort of the cool sort of Marlon Brando street sort of style with the high art of couture. So he was the first one to see that you could bring that together and you could create a completely new, different, exuberant, fun, wonderful look.
He sort of reinvented the definition of what a fashion designer could be in culture. So he's not a tasteful in the background, putting the clothes out there, but receding in his own personality. That's not what he did. That he brought his personality as a celebrity forward. And so he became the personification of his fashion lines and the symbol of something that was really quite large.
And he was a very good front person for the business. People recognized him, people knew him. And my recollection was it was all very, very positive.
Versace mixed with the top people in the world, the top celebrities, the rock stars, the royalty.
Elton John was one of his biggest consumers of Gianni Versace's male fashions. Gianni Versace used to say that Elton John had more pieces in his collection than Gianni had still left in his own collection. He loved the color and the glamour. He dressed his tours. He dressed his, his family, everybody. His sister was very much friends with the supermodels. She realized the power of these girls who were getting a lot of paparazzi attention, and she understood that she could bring that to the house and kind of create this mix of these girls on the runway in these extraordinary clothes.
Versace was an international mover and shaker, And with business success came wealth.
This exponential growth in the 70s and particularly the 80s and really early 90s afforded him quite a rich lifestyle. I mean, he began to buy, his passions were to buy houses and to buy works of art. So he bought one of these old line, beautiful, huge palazzos in Milan, which became his home and his atelier. He began to buy houses in New York and most famously, of course, the house in Miami. He had this beautiful villa on Lake Como, right outside Milan. His artwork and buying art was a huge and hugely expensive passion. By the time he was into the 90s, he had one of the world-class collection of Picassos. He had more than 20 Picasso paintings.
Gianni Versace was at the top of his game. He was 50 years old. He had risen to the top echelon of celebrity in the world. He was going to New York to list his company on the New York Stock Exchange for $1.5 billion, which was a huge amount at the time, and the first Italian fashion house to do that. And then he came down to Miami.
As Gianni Versace prepared to divide his time between Europe and the United States across the summer of 1997, he was not to know that the man who was to decide his destiny was about to begin a killing spree, which was to stretch across 4 states. Late April, and Cunanan was en route to Minnesota. A particularly harsh winter meant that Minnesotans were looking forward to milder weather and a chance to get out and about. David Matson, a former lover of Cunanan's, and their mutual friend Jeff Trail had distanced themselves from Andrew and were none too pleased when they heard he was coming to town.
David Matson was the love of his life, from what everyone says, and he was an architect, a very prominent architect in Minneapolis. And Jeffrey Trail was friends with Andrew, and he was also friends with David Matson. But the word is that Jeffrey Trail was kind of telling David Matson, this guy's not good for you, he's bad news. And I think that somehow got back to Andrew Cunanan. So I do know that Andrew Cunanan was not very happy with Jeffrey Trail.
He arrived in Minneapolis on April 25th, and for the first couple days, it seemed like they got along. They went out to dinner with friends. He stayed at another friend's apartment.
But suddenly, things changed.
He thought the two of them might be having an affair, and it made him outrageously jealous. For some reason, he took a claw hammer and he beat Jeff Trail to death. It was amazing that Andrew was able to overpower Jeffrey Trail, because Trail was a Navy veteran. He had been in the Gulf War. He had trained to be a highway patrolman, and he was a buff individual. Andrew must have attacked Trail in a fury. There was blood all over the place. He wrapped him up in a rug and he stole his gun.
Several days later, David Matson is found murdered, shot twice, once in the chest, once in the head, near a lake about 50, 60 miles away from his home where Jeffrey Trail was killed.
And he had been shot with a .40 caliber gun that would end up being tied to Jeffrey Trail.
Now responsible for 2 murders, Cunanan made his way to Chicago.
Andrew drove David Matson's stolen Cherokee to Chicago, where he encountered Lee Miglin. No one knows if they knew each other before this or if this was a new meeting. Lee Miglin was an executive for the Home Shopping Network, and he was a local developer, and he was, by all accounts, very well liked in the area.
But Lee Miglin was to die in a sadistic frenzy.
He tortured Lee Miglin to death. He had a gun, he didn't use it on him. He slashed his throat, he bludgeoned him, he wrapped his face with duct tape, he bound him, and he just beat him to death.
It was a very strange attack on Lee Miglin. It was personal, it was vicious, it was like there was something that Cunanan was trying to prove, and it was a terrible thing. And he stole money out of the safe, and then he stole Lee Miglin's 1996 Lexus and drove towards New York.
It's not until after Lee Miglin is killed that Andrew Cunanan is linked to all three of those murders.
Now one of the FBI's 10 most wanted people in the United States, right across the country, law enforcement officials now knew just how dangerous the 28-year-old could be. But Cunanan was en route to committing the most audacious, life-defining act of his extraordinary killing spree.
The FBI is now involved in the case because Lee Miglin was a very high-profile individual in Chicago. Now we're talking about 3 murders. Now they're calling Andrew Cunanan a spree killer, serial killer, different labels from the FBI, and they're trying to track him. So they put a trigger fish on Lee Miglin's car through his mobile phone, and Andrew is driving in the direction of South Florida. And he's going through New Jersey, and he hears on the radio that the FBI is on his tail and that they're closing in on him. And the triangulation of the phone, and all this comes out on the radio.
So at that point, he rips out the telephone, but apparently they were still able to track him with the receiver.
Now panicking, Andrew knew he was in a race against time.
Cunanan drove out to Finns Point National Cemetery, where he encountered William Reese, who was the caretaker there. William Reese was a 45-year-old family man. By all intents and purposes, just a wonderful guy, and his family loved him.
Reese never stood a chance.
Cunanan shot William Reese. He stole his Chevy truck, and that's the one that he drove down to Miami.
And he was brutally traveling around the country and shooting people. And they couldn't catch him. Why they could not catch him, I don't know, but they couldn't. And no one knew where he was going.
So at that point, he's on the run, and he starts driving south. South Beach was a mecca for gay men, certainly. It had been from the 80s, and it was really, which is part of the why Gianni Versace had bought a house there and established. And part of the myth of South Beach was certainly created by Gianni Versace. So he was a big figure in South Beach. And this leads some to think that Cunanan, driving south, knew that South Beach could be a place where he could melt into, where he could possibly find some support. There are a lot of Latino immigrants there, so he could kind of blend in perhaps with the communities there. So he heads to South Beach. The extraordinary thing is he drives there, he goes there, he checks into a hotel under his own name, even though he is one of the most wanted men in the US at that point.
For investigators, the hunt for one of America's most wanted men went cold. But in Florida, Andrew would hide in plain sight for over 2 months. Gianni Versace, meanwhile, had arrived in Miami Beach.
This is the 90s. The 80s, in the midst of the drug and cocaine wars, there were a lot of homicides in the city of Miami and in Dade County as a whole. By the 90s, a lot of this had moved on. There were still a fair amount of homicides, but the numbers had been dropping.
So at this time, South Beach had cleaned up a lot from its previous years. Art Deco and had brought it back, and Miami Vice and tourism, and the city was really moving in the right direction.
And ultimately, the city turned around, and Versace is to be credited in some regard to taking this old degenerate hotel and creating a modern palace right in the heart of Ocean Drive.
Versace loved the life in Miami Beach. It was colorful, it was energetic, it reminded him of the Mediterranean in the 70s, I suppose. And the other celebrities followed him. Prince came, opened a place on Ocean Drive not far away. Sylvester Stallone and Madonna bought places nearby in Coconut Grove. It really introduced a whole new celebrity atmosphere to the place. Some people called Versace the mayor, the unofficial mayor of Miami Beach. Others called him the emperor. Some people called him a spiritual advisor.
Gianni Versace lived a very carefree life. Everybody loved him, everybody liked him in the community. He didn't feel threatened. He didn't want bodyguards. He walked alone everywhere, even with his friends. He wanted to be alone sometimes. He knew everybody liked him. Why would anybody want to hurt him? That was his mentality.
When he was in New York or Milan, he had at least 3. It was like the Secret Service guarding the president, okay? And that's what it should have been like. But in Miami, he felt so relaxed, he didn't want that around. The paparazzi were not here. It was his place, and that's what he liked about it, where he can go every day. Him and his boyfriend went to a certain beach on 13th Street, and nobody would bother him.
He talked to people. He's a very nice person. Never was rude, never was standoffish. Very, very nice guy, very nice guy.
He was gentle, he was artistic, he was subdued. He wasn't the type of person who brought bad feelings against him from anybody else.
Meanwhile, Andrew Cunanan had found a base in South Beach.
Andrew Cunanan ended up in this really kind of a dive of a hotel, very, very far from the glitzy part where Gianni Versace had established his crew and his house and all that. He was paying cash and he was living low, but it was a very seedy area of South Beach.
The Normandy Plaza was the ideal place for Andrew Cunanan to hide. It was a place that nobody really wanted to go. It was a rundown, dilapidated old house. Even the owner didn't like to go up to the 2nd and 3rd floors without a police escort. This was a huge fall from grace for Andrew Cunanan. A couple months earlier, he'd been living in a $1 million mansion on the Pacific coast, and now he was living in a $30 a day dump on Miami Beach.
But despite his activities of the last few weeks, Cunanan was not keeping out of sight.
He would frequent the gay clubs. He must have been hustling some money from people that he met at the clubs. He was doing drugs. He went out at night, but sometimes he would go to the more upscale places as well. He had suits that he'd probably stolen from Lee Miglin, and he went to local porn shops and he bought magazines there. He sort of lived a life, I guess, that was similar to what he'd been living in San Diego.
He was very good at blending in. He had a lot of different looks. Like, he would change his look on a daily basis. Sometimes he would dye his hair. Sometimes he'd wear glasses, other times not. The way he dressed was different. So he was kind of doing that on purpose. Obviously, he knew he was wanted. South Beach was a busy place. It wasn't like you're walking in a neighborhood that there's 5 people walking around. There's thousands and thousands of people walking around. Like, it's kind of like a mini New York kind of scene, especially at night.
Unless you happen to be watching America's Most Wanted or a particular news show, it really wasn't very well broadcast in South Florida. We had no idea that he was among us.
With Cunanan managing to live his life undetected, he had the perfect opportunity to plan his most shocking murder yet.
Andrew Cunanan had the pickup truck at the Normandy Hotel, but then on first week of June, he parks that pickup truck inside the 13th Street parking garage, which is about 1.5 blocks from Gianni Versace's house. And I think he stalks the house and surveils the house and is waiting for Gianni Versace, but Gianni Versace wasn't in town. It wasn't until very shortly after Gianni Versace arrives, a day or two, that the murder takes place. So I believe that Andrew Cunanan was waiting for Gianni Versace to murder him.
Tuesday, 15th July, was another predictably beautiful day in Miami Beach. By 9 a.m., the temperature was already 81 degrees as Gianni Versace left his palatial home on Ocean Drive.
So Gianni Versace had just flown in from Europe. He had finished his last couture show in Paris. He was jet-lagged, and so he was getting up very, very early in the morning. He was an early riser anyway. First thing he did was to call his sister, who was running a fashion show under his line in Rome, a secondary show that he let her run. So he called her and was pestering her about how the show was going, what the decisions she was making. and then he put the phone down. He then decided to go, as he did most days, to take a walk up to the news cafe, just a few blocks from his house.
Versace had a fairly regular routine. He'd wake up in the morning, he'd go for a stroll down the street to the news cafe. At the news cafe, he'd purchase a couple newspapers, have some coffee, and then wander back home.
He was here on South Beach. That was his routine every morning. So it's very easy for anyone that wanted to do any harm to him to know his routine.
Versace arrived at the news cafe around 8:30. He bought 5 magazines for $15 and had a cup of coffee. And then he strolled back up the street on the west side of the street where his house was, with nothing to fear. He got to his gate. He was putting in the key to the gate when witnesses say a man ran up to him and shot him twice in the head.
Within a minute, we had a radio call from one of our uniformed police officers that there was shots fired at 1116 Ocean Drive.
There were 2 big shots, and there were people in the house. There was Antonio D'Amico, who was Versace's longtime lover, and Lázaro Quintana, who was a friend who was supposed to be there to play tennis with him. And they both ran out of the house, and Quintana found Versace on the steps. There was a woman there who said, "He went that way," or something, who pointed out the direction that the shooter had gone. Lázaro very bravely followed the shooter down the street at a pretty quick gait.
Once the man saw Lázaro running towards him, he ran north on Ocean Drive, he ran west on 12th Street, down the alley, and he ran into a parking garage. But before he did that, he stopped and pointed a gun at Lázaro, so Lázaro went in a different direction.
Just blocks away, there was pandemonium on the steps of Versace's mansion.
Well, it must have been horrendous for the people in the house because they were all very long-time friends and they loved one another. And to have something like that happen right in front of your house. Antonio D'Amico was outside the house, and yes, he was screaming. He was in grief. He was broken.
He was shot once in the left side of his cheek next to the nose, and once in the right side of his neck when he turned. So his chances of survival were not very good.
The ambulance came. The emergency medical team was very quick. They put him in the ambulance. They rushed him to Jackson Memorial Hospital.
And he was pronounced dead about an hour and a half after he had been shot.
He was shot at point-blank range. There was no way he could possibly have survived an onslaught like that.
The question on everybody's lips was, who could have done this and why?
Like any homicide, the first thing you're thinking is, who could have done this? But when you find out you're dealing with someone as famous as Gianni Versace, your mind just goes crazy because he's worldwide. So this is not like a local homicide where your suspect pool may be in the area or local. This could be anyone from any part of the world. It was pretty obvious that whoever did this knew they were gunning down Mr. Versace.
Cunanan had made his escape by cab from the parking garage. But the red pickup truck that Andrew Cunanan had stolen from William Reese in New Jersey was about to give his identity away.
We did a search of the garage. We located a red pickup truck on the 3rd level with damp, sweaty clothing on the outside of it. So we were pretty certain that was the suspect that we were looking for.
Police searched the pickup and they found Andrew Cunanan's passport. They found receipts from New York. and other receipts from his travels and identification from some of his previous victims.
It was a world of evidence inside the pickup truck that we were able to piece together a timeline of where he was, where he came from, when he arrived.
Under the intense scrutiny of the media, detectives now had to track down Andrew Cunanan, a man responsible for 5 murders across the United States.
Once we found out it was Andrew Cunanan that we were looking for, we plastered his face all over the media. Once that happened, we started receiving tips immediately.
They put out an APB, they blocked the streets, they blocked the causeways going over to Miami, and did a citywide search for Cunanan.
If you can imagine 300 to 400 detectives, police officers from different agencies looking for Andrew Cunanan in a 7 square mile area, kind of gives you an idea. There was police on every corner pretty much.
At this point, he was no longer able to stay in hiding. His picture was being blasted out on the networks nationwide, and there was a nationwide manhunt for him.
With the images of Andrew Cunanan now circulating, it became clear that he had been living in the area in plain sight before the murder of Versace.
We got a call on July 12th from the Miami Subs, located right across the street from the Normandy Hotel where Andrew was staying. The cashier there saw on America's Most Wanted, saw Andrew, and he thought he looked like someone he saw on America's Most Wanted. They called 911, police officer was dispatched. Police arrived there within 8 minutes and Andrew Cunanan was gone. I feel very strongly that that was Andrew Cunanan.
But an unusual lead was now to take them closer to Cunanan.
There was also a pawn shop that Andrew had visited and pawned gold coins that he had stolen out of Lee Miglin's safe.
Pawn shops required that you sign a certain form, and he put his real name on it, he used his real passport information, and he put his real address.
There was an address to the Normandy Hotel, room 205. So we immediately got a search warrant. We surrounded the Normandy Hotel. We waited for a search warrant from a judge to be signed, and once we received the warrant, we executed the warrant. We broke in with a SWAT team, and there was another couple there that completely unrelated to Andrew Cunanan. We scared the devil out of them.
Cunanan had actually stayed in a few different rooms in the hotel, and eventually he ended up in room 322, which overlooked the water. The media went in there, and they found a very rundown apartment with books he'd been reading. He had magazines. He had porno magazines. It was obvious that he had been there.
But the elusive Andrew Cunanan remained one step ahead of the law.
Several times we felt that we were getting close to him based on evidence that was left behind. But it seemed like we always missed him by nothing.
It was very confusing for both the media and for law enforcement officials because he could change his looks. There were some reports that he had shaved all his body hair and he was going in drag. His friends had said that he could change his looks on a dime. He would change them several times a day, even back in San Francisco when there was no reason to. He was a chameleon. He could just blend in anywhere.
We were kind of chasing our tail there for a little bit, trying to find him, and yeah, we couldn't find him. We felt he was still in the city.
Cunanan seemed to have disappeared into thin air. Nobody knows how he could possibly get away from this area with so much commotion going on. But either he walked or he took a cab a couple miles north and he broke into a little sailboat that was docked along the waterway. Just a little ways up from the sailboat, he found this houseboat that was vacant.
Cunanan's hiding place was about to be disturbed by the caretaker of the houseboat.
The caretaker opened the door and walks into the hallway, and instantly he knew that somebody was living there, somebody who shouldn't be there. Suddenly he hears a gunshot.
The caretaker immediately bolted from the scene and alerted the authorities.
When the call went out, we all felt that this is a very good possibility that this is Andrew Cunanan. So we arrived, surrounded the houseboat, called the SWAT team in. The SWAT team, hostage negotiator, tried to negotiate, but no one was talking on the inside.
I mean, the world is holding its collective breath. Is this the guy? What's going on?
They fired gas into the houseboat, ended up going in there, and they found what turned out to be Andrew Cunanan, shot once in the mouth, laying in a bed upstairs.
I think he was probably already upstairs when the caretaker entered the houseboat. At this point, he probably thought it was police. He thought it was the end. There was nothing else for him to do. And at this point, he shot himself.
The 8-day manhunt for one of America's most wanted men was finally over.
We were able to say that was Andrew Cunanan. We had matched the fingerprints, and we were able to say that was the gun that killed Gianni Versace.
We actually high-fived because we were just glad that it was over, glad that nobody else was going to be hurt, glad that we were going to get some sleep, just glad on many levels, even though, that's not the way I wanted it to end, because I really had a lot of questions I wanted to ask him, but that's the way it did end.
He had been watching himself on the TV. He had been eating scraps from the cupboards, peanuts, candy, I guess, things like that. And he only had $6 left that they found on the table.
I think at that point, if he could really commit the crime of the decade, the crime, that would make his name, forever kind of infamous, then that was what he was after. I mean, if you can try to understand or get into the head of a man who's clearly so unbalanced and so sick at that point, I think that everything that inside him that was unrealized, that he felt he deserved more, that he wanted to have more, I think that came out in a rage and a sickness that was eventually directed at Gianni Versace.
Rumors still swirl about why he may have done this. What was his motivation? Was there some connection between Cunanan and Versace, which led to Mr. Versace's very untimely death?
If Cunanan's only victim had been Versace, we would be talking about a typical celebrity stalker who went after a powerful, successful person, and we would see, I think we would see Cunanan as a psychotic, but Cunanan was hardly psychotic. He was much more a typical sociopath, someone without a conscience, someone who was extremely vengeful, and I would put Versace in the same category as most of his other victims. People he felt had wronged him, and he wanted to get even.
We'll never know, but what Andrew Cunanan did during his killing spree and his most high-profile killing of July 1997 impacted on the world of fashion. It was truly shocking, and it may never be explained.